So I wanted to do this video last year as a Revenge of the Remakes where I compare Red Dragon to Manhunter, but unfortunately I couldn't get my hands on a copy of Manhunter in time. So now right before the spooky season really kicks off, I'm going to review what's really the second half of my Red Dragon video that I did last year. Manhunter. Now, Manhunter came out in 1986, was directed by Michael Mann, and is the first adaptation of Thomas Harris's book, Red Dragon. And I don't know why they didn't just use the title Red Dragon. I don't know. I think that's a pretty great title, and it definitely works in the remake, which is called Red Dragon. So I don't know why they didn't call it that here. But Manhunter is actually, I think, a pretty apt description of this movie, because this is a manhunt kind of movie. And that is the story of William Peterson's Will Graham hunting down Tom Noonan's Francis Dollarhide, aka the Tooth Fairy, before he can kill another family. So Will Graham and the FBI, they're trying to figure this out. They're trying to get a read on this guy, trying to figure out what's the connection between these two families. How's he picking his targets? They know it has something to do with the full moon and the idea of becoming, but they don't really know what that means. And again, the whole movie is them trying to piece everything together. And if you've seen Red Dragon or the last season of Hannibal, you've seen this story play out pretty much the exact same way 3 different times. This would be the first time it's ever been presented, and as a first time, I think it's pretty successful. Now, I am going to kind of discount the show Hannibal in talking about this adaptation, because that show, while really good in the last season, it does take a few more liberties than the other 2 versions do, and by the nature of it being a TV series, they can flesh out a lot more different things, and it just doesn't seem fair to compare it to this standalone movie. So when I do talk about how other versions have done it, I'm really going to be talking about the Brett Ratner version, Red Dragon, because that one does have a lot of DNA very closely associated with this movie. And while this is not a Revenge of the Remakes, because I am splitting it up into 2 videos, I will still be somewhat comparing them just to see how does it fare, because this movie I feel like is kind of an underrated gem. Because even though people do know about it, and people who follow this kind of serial killer genre definitely have this on their wall, they definitely watch it and they definitely compare the different versions, but I feel like most people don't know this because the Hannibal Lecter movies that started with Silence of the Lambs kind of overshadowed this version. And after watching this for the first time, I can say that, yeah, the Anthony Hopkins movies are on the whole better, or at least the good ones, Silence of the Lambs and Red Dragon being the good ones. Because what those movies are able to pull off in one movie with depth and character and personality is leaps and bounds above what this movie does. And this movie isn't bad by any means. It is actually pretty good, and it does do its job well. You get in the mindset of these characters, especially how William Peterson plays Will Graham in this. He definitely walks that line between hero and anti-hero, because he can get inside the mind of these serial killers and use his imagination to kind of piece together what happened here, what's the motivation. He can really understand them. What does that do to his psyche? Does that make him just as reprehensible as the people he despises? Hannibal Lecter seems to think so, and he uses that to kind of manipulate Will. And that's really one of the things that this version does the best. I love this portrayal of Will, because you do see that dark side, and you do feel like if he was pushed too far, he would slip and potentially become a serial killer himself. You definitely feel that a lot more. And another character that I feel like I need to talk about, even though he doesn't get that much screen time, is Hannibal Lecter. In this version, he gets a couple scenes, but he doesn't get nearly the same amount of screen time as Anthony Hopkins gets in his version, because Anthony Hopkins is a much bigger name. Here, Hannibal is played by Brian Cox, who's still a pretty big name. People know who he is. He's a recognizable actor, and here as Hannibal Lecter, he does a really good job. Now, is he as iconic as Anthony Hopkins was as Hannibal Lecter? Not really, but just watching this movie on its own merits, he does a really good job at just getting under your skin. Brian Cox has this dry delivery that just feels so heartless and kind of cruel, but at the same time, there is still personality behind it. The way he kind of mumbles some of his words, it draws attention to his mouth, and you know what that mouth has done to human flesh, and it just makes you so uneasy by watching him. Now, I would have loved if they had expanded his role a little bit more like they have in subsequent adaptations, to give him a little bit more screen time. While he's still very much a supporting character in Red Dragon, they do find some creative ways to give him more screen time, give him a bit more of a presence without compromising the actual movie. Because again, at the end of the day, it's Will versus the Tooth Fairy. And the Tooth Fairy in this version is interesting because he's very much your typical serial killer type. I don't get that much sympathy from him in this version. Here he's probably the most creepy and unsettling. He gives me a lot more Buffalo Bill vibes than Francis Dollarhide from Red Dragon. I think part of that has to do with the pacing of this movie, because the first half of this movie is from Will's perspective. He's hunting the Tooth Fairy, and you're seeing Will and Jack Crawford and the FBI trying to put together what's going on with the Tooth Fairy. You haven't really seen him. He's kept very much in the shadows. You don't really know what he's all about. And then around the midpoint, you actually start to see a lot more of the Tooth Fairy, what he's all about. His relationship with Reba, the blind lady that he works with. And in this version, you don't really buy the relationship, that it's really a mutual longing for each other. It still has its sweeter moments, but because all this was saved for the second half of the movie, you spent the whole first half getting this mental picture of the kind of monster this guy is, and then when you actually see him and see him interact, it doesn't really do that much to challenge those preconceived ideas. You still just see him as a creep and killer. And you don't really see the human tortured side that you see in Red Dragon. And I feel like that was kind of a missed opportunity, because Francis Dollarhide is a really interesting character. I feel like he's a lot more complex an antagonist than Buffalo Bill. Buffalo Bill was just a straight up creep and just the worst of humanity. But Francis Dollarhide's story is a lot more sad. The fact that he actually tried and for a short time had a functioning romantic relationship speaks volumes to his character. And this movie just doesn't quite stick the landing on that aspect. And the last big character I'm going to talk about is a character that I didn't really expect to be talking about in this version, but he really left an impression, because you have Stephen Lang as the reporter Freddie Lounds. And Freddie Lounds has always been an interesting character for me, because he is a supporting character. He doesn't get that much screen time, but with that screen time, Freddie always has such a big presence in this story, because he's a reporter. He's a sleazeball. He's just trying to get clicks or sell papers. He doesn't have any kind of scruples, but him and Will do work together at some point to try to set a trap for Dollarhide, and that backfires tremendously. And yeah, that's the end of Freddy. He gets lit on fire and just rolled down the street. I don't know why, but in every version of this story, when you see the shot of the flaming wheelchair just rolling by, no matter how it's composed or edited, it always kind of makes me laugh in this darkly comedic way, because it's not supposed to be comedic. This is a man who's dead and burning and just hauled off like he doesn't even matter. This is supposed to be a really horrific moment, but I don't know, there's just something about a flaming wheelchair just rolling by, and then the expression on the security guard's face as he sees it, it just kind of plays off as comedic. I don't know, maybe that's just me being messed up and twisted and having seen probably too many dark comedies, but I don't know, let me know in the comments if you've had a similar reaction to these scenes. But the other thing about Stephen Lang's portrayal of Freddy in this movie is that not only is he sleazy, but you get a sense that he's not stupid. He actually is pretty smart for a journalist. You see him putting pieces together. He's got these shifty eyes, and I don't know why, but Stephen Lang in this version looks a lot like Brad Dourif. I actually thought that was Brad Dourif as Freddie Lounds until I looked it up. I was like, that's a very young Stephen Lang. That's actually kind of impressive. And as far as the rest of this movie, it does follow the basic plot line as Red Dragon the book and Red Dragon the remake. All the beats do play out, and I don't want to belabor that in this video, because in my Red Dragon video, I already went in depth about the actual plot line. So if you don't know the story, you go to that one, and it basically follows the same thing, except for a couple notable differences. For one, I already talked about the difference with Hannibal Lecter. He doesn't get nearly as much screen time, and a lot of that is because the opening of this movie is very different. This movie opens with one of the families getting murdered. Now, it's still kind of played mysteriously, and you don't actually see all the horrible things that Dollarhide does to these bodies, but you do see him enter the house, see them sleeping, and we are immediately drawn into the FBI and all the shenanigans going on trying to hunt the Tooth Fairy. But Red Dragon doesn't really do it that way. Red Dragon has a prologue where we actually see how Will Graham caught Hannibal Lecter, and it kind of sets up their relationship a little bit earlier, because by the time we actually see Brian Cox's Hannibal Lecter in this movie, he's been mentioned before, and it's been brought up through exposition and dialogue that, oh yeah, Will Graham locked him away, and it was this big traumatic event, and all these things went haywire. It's a really messy deal, and it's a good thing that that's in his past. That's why he's retired, but now he's brought back in, so of course these conversations about Hannibal Lecter are going to pop up again. And I also find it interesting that in this version, Will Graham goes to Hannibal Lecter on his own. He's like, okay, I need to get back in this serial killer headspace, and he goes to see Hannibal Lecter, where in other versions, he's had to be kind of talked into bringing Lecter on board as a consultant to hunt this serial killer. And I feel like that also speaks to Will Graham's psyche in this movie, that he has this weird fascination with serial killers, that he wants to bring Hannibal Lecter in, even though he knows it's really dangerous and it's going to bring him closer to that edge. He just can't help himself. It's this pull. It's like gravity. He just has to go see Lecter to get in that headspace. There's a lot that you can learn about Will and his characterization from just that motivation. Now, the last thing I want to touch on before I wrap up this video is the actual design of the Tooth Fairy in this version, because it's very different than what I was expecting. In other versions, I've seen it pretty consistent. He's got the big red dragon tattoo on his back. And in this one, it's on his chest. It's on the front of him. And I don't actually know which one is truer to the book. I haven't read the entirety of the book. I've read some excerpts here and there, so I have kind of a rough idea as to what plot-wise was included in the book and what was made up and was creative license. But as far as the actual details of, okay, what did his tattooing look like? I have no idea. I plan on reading the book in the near future, so I'll probably figure it out then. But if you want to drop it in the comments and let me know which version is more accurate, feel free. But aside from whether the front or the back is more accurate, the actual painting, the William Blake painting of the Red Dragon that they use in these different versions are different paintings, which I was not expecting. I was like, okay, we have the classic Red Dragon one from Red Dragon. I feel like that's the one that the book was referencing, but I'm not entirely sure because Blake did several different Red Dragon and Woman Clothed in Sun paintings over his career. This is one where the dragon is more bird-like, and you do have more of an emphasis on the Woman Clothed in Sun in the composition than you do with the other one, which is interesting because none of these versions that I've seen have really focused on the Woman Clothed in Sun, because while what he does with the moms of the family can kind of speak for themselves, the Woman Clothed in Sun in the romantic relationship is much more interesting because she becomes ultimately the undoing of the Red Dragon. It creates this really bitter conflict that I wish was developed more in this version. It's kind of underplayed a little bit. I wish in the actual writing of the story they brought out that theme a little bit more, because I think that's one of the most fascinating things about Francis Dollarhide and his psychosis is based on these archetypes that William Blake adapted into his paintings. I just think that that works on a literary and script level so well that really none of these movies have taken advantage of. But even though this other Blake painting does kind of give a little more personality and having it on the chest does make it more visual, I do prefer the tattooing of the remake better because it just feels so monstrous and imposing and dominating than this one. This one just feels kind of more artistic and subtle, whereas the other one was definitely him becoming the Red Dragon. You can see that happening on screen. But all in all, this version of Red Dragon was a surprise to me. I actually found myself enjoying it. Now, there are things that other versions have done better and have developed further. But as for a 1986 first attempt at doing this kind of thing, I think it's pretty successful. It's a fun time. It's an easy watch. It's not nearly as horrifying and skin-crawly as some of these other Hannibal Lecter movies. But that's not to say it doesn't have anything disturbing in it. Just the basic concept of the serial killer doing these things to these families is enough to make anybody's skin crawl, but I feel like it's all kind of underplayed and played a little safer because they didn't want to go too shocking and horrifying with what they could have done with the source material, which other versions have definitely explored a lot more. But now I turn over to you guys. What do you think about Manhunter, the first Hannibal Lecter movie? Whatever you think, let me know in the comments, and if you like this video, be sure to give it a like and subscribe for more content, and hit the notification bell to be notified every time I upload a video. And as always, I'm Colby. This is my Nerdy Talk, and I'll see you in the next video.